100 years of preparation, 50,000 elite warriors, the most sophisticated invasion fleet in galactic history. And it all went spectacularly wrong in exactly 12 minutes and 37 seconds. But to understand how such a magnificent failure was possible, we need to go back to where it all began, in the bureaucratic nightmare that was the Kralaxian Empire's high command. The Kralaxian Empire prided itself on being the most methodical, detail-oriented, and thoroughly prepared military force in the known galaxy. They were the kind of civilization that would spend 43 years debating the optimal temperature for conference rooms and consider it time well spent. When they decided to invade a planet, they didn't just throw together a quick battle plan over lunch. Oh no, they created committees, subcommittees, study groups, and advisory panels. They commissioned reports, conducted feasibility studies, and held focus groups with their military's brightest minds. The decision to invade Earth had been made by the Council of 17 Ice Stalks after a particularly exhausting 72-hour debate about territorial expansion in the Sol sector. The vote had been unanimous, though that was largely because 3 of the council members had fallen asleep during hour 68 and just agreed with whatever everyone else was saying. The third planet from the star, designated Sol Prime, shall be incorporated into the Empire, declared Supreme Councillor Threx Valdron, whose name meant something like "he who speaks too loudly at meetings" in ancient Kralaxian. We shall call this glorious undertaking Operation Terrestrial Cleansing. The applause was thunderous, mainly because Kralaxians had 14 tentacles each and could really make some noise when they put their minds to it. But here's where things started to go wrong, though nobody realized it at the time. The Empire's intelligence division, known officially as the Department of Extraterrestrial Information Gathering and unofficially as those guys who watch TV all day, had been monitoring Earth through intercepted broadcast signals for decades. Unfortunately, due to the peculiarities of interstellar communication and the fact that their best intelligence officer had a chronic gambling problem and kept missing his shifts, their most recent data was from 1954. This meant that the Kralaxian military's entire understanding of human civilization was based on episodes of I Love Lucy, The Ed Sullivan Show, and whatever else had been broadcasting during the Eisenhower administration. They had compiled extensive dossiers on human behavior patterns, technological capabilities, and social structures, all of which painted a picture of a species that was charmingly primitive and completely unprepared for interstellar warfare. According to our intelligence, reported Chief Analyst Verxa Thimbleton during the initial planning session, humans are a simple bipedal species that communicates primarily through something called sock hops, and whose most advanced technology appears to be large boxes that display moving pictures in black and white. "Fascinating," exclaimed General Blorg Weasel, who had been put in charge of military planning. "And what of their weapons capabilities?" "Primitive projectile weapons, sir. Something called guns that fire small metal pellets. Our battle armor should be more than sufficient to withstand such crude attacks." "Excellent. And their space program?" "They appear to be obsessed with something called rocket ships, but these are clearly fictional constructs used for entertainment purposes. They have no actual space travel capabilities." Indeed, what the Kralaxians didn't know, of course, was that in the 70 years since their last intelligence update, humans had developed a few new toys. Little things like nuclear weapons, satellite technology, the internet, and the ability to put people on the moon and bring them back alive. But the Empire's military planners were blissfully unaware of these developments as they began the most thorough invasion preparation in galactic history. Commander Vexathula Grimjaw had been selected to lead the invasion force after a rigorous selection process that involved written examinations, psychological evaluations, and a surprisingly difficult obstacle course involving rubber ducks. His name which sounded terrifying in Krelaxian, roughly translated to Kevin who likes soup in Standard Galactic. But nobody mentioned this because it would have hurt his feelings. Vex Thular was the kind of military officer who color-coded his sock drawer and alphabetized his breakfast cereals. He approached the Earth invasion with the same meticulous attention to detail that he brought to everything else in his life, which is to say, he created spreadsheets for his spreadsheets and held planning meetings to plan other planning meetings. "Gentlemen," he announced to his assembled staff officers during their first strategy session, "we have been tasked with the conquest of the third planet from Sol. This is not a mission we undertake lightly. We shall spend the next 100 years preparing for every possible contingency." "Sir," replied his deputy, Colonel Rex Bimblebottom, whose enthusiasm often exceeded his intelligence, "might I suggest that 100 years is perhaps excessive for such a primitive species?" Vex Thular fixed him with a stare that could have frozen molten lava. "Colonel, the Krelaxian Empire has conquered 17 star systems precisely because we do not underestimate our enemies. We shall train, we shall prepare, and we shall be ready for anything these humans can throw at us." And so began the most comprehensive military training program in galactic history. The Empire established the Academy of Terrestrial Combat Studies on the remote planet of Grex Nubulator 7, where 50,000 of their finest warriors would spend the next century learning everything there was to know about fighting humans. The curriculum was extensive. Courses included human psychology and behavioral patterns, primitive projectile weapon defense, urban combat in black and white environments, and advanced sock-hop disruption techniques. The Academy's faculty consisted of the Empire's most brilliant military minds, all of whom had studied the intercepted Earth broadcasts with scholarly dedication. Professor Klux Fibblewott, who taught the course on human social structures, was particularly proud of his work. "Students," he would announce to each new class, "humans organize themselves into primitive tribal units called nuclear families. The male of the species goes out each day to engage in something called work, while the female remains at home to prepare food and maintain the dwelling. Their offspring spend their time attending schools where they learn to read and write using primitive symbols." The tactical training was equally thorough. Students learned to counter human gang warfare, which was based on West Side Story, to infiltrate human social gatherings, derived from sitcom party scenes, and to neutralize human authority figures, who appeared to be people in uniforms who said things like, "What's all this then?" in oddly theatrical voices. The weapons training was perhaps the most elaborate part of the program. Krelaxian warriors spent decades learning to dodge slow-moving projectiles, to take cover behind the large metal vehicles that humans apparently used for transportation, and to navigate the maze-like structures that humans called cities, but which looked suspiciously like the sets from early television shows. "The key to victory," explained Master Sergeant Grox Whiffleton during a typical training session, "is understanding that humans are predictable. They will always announce their intentions before acting. They frequently stop in the middle of conflicts to exchange witty dialogue, and they have an inexplicable tendency to split up when facing danger." Flight training was conducted using specially modified spacecraft designed to simulate the atmospheric conditions of Earth. The pilots learned to navigate around the primitive aircraft that humans used for transportation, which, according to their intelligence, consisted mainly of propeller-driven vehicles that moved at laughably slow speeds. "Remember," shouted flight instructor Blox Thimbleton as his students practiced aerial maneuvers, "human aircraft are loud, slow, and completely unable to reach the altitudes necessary for orbital flight. They will pose no threat to our superior technology." The Psychological Warfare Division spent considerable effort developing techniques specifically designed to demoralize human defenders. They studied the apparent human obsession with something called television programming, and concluded that disrupting these broadcasts would cause immediate social collapse. Humans appear to be completely dependent on their entertainment transmissions, reported Dr. Vrex's Nugglebottom, the Empire's leading expert on xenopsychology. If we can interfere with their ability to watch I Love Lucy or The Honeymooners, their entire civilization will crumble within hours. The medical corps prepared for treating casualties inflicted by human weapons, which according to their research consisted mainly of small firearms that fired metal projectiles at relatively low velocities. They developed specialized first aid techniques for treating what they termed primitive projectile wounds, and stocked their medical ships with supplies specifically designed to counter human chemical warfare agents such as tear gas and pepper spray. The humans may attempt to blind our warriors with airborne irritants, warned Chief Medical Officer Rex Bugelheimer during a typical briefing. But we have developed countermeasures for all known human chemical weapons, including something called stink bombs, which appear to be used primarily by human juveniles. The engineering corps designed specialized equipment for Earth combat, including environmental suits capable of operating in Earth's primitive atmosphere, communication devices programmed with extensive databases of 1950s English, and weapon systems specifically calibrated to neutralize human technology without causing unnecessary collateral damage to the quaint historical artifacts they expected to find. Our plasma rifles have been carefully tuned, explained Chief Engineer Throx Bimmelton, to disable human vehicles without damaging their antique internal combustion engines. We want to preserve these primitive machines for study in our museums. The Intelligence Division spent decades analyzing every scrap of intercepted Earth data, creating detailed maps of human cities based on television show sets, compiling dictionaries of human language based on sitcom dialogue, and developing profiles of human leadership based on the apparent authority figures they observed in the broadcasts. The humans appear to be governed by a series of tribal chiefs, reported intelligence analyst Knox Whipplesworth. These leaders wear distinctive costumes and communicate through ritualized exchanges of dialogue. The most important decisions are apparently made by individuals who stand in front of groups and speak in loud voices. The Logistics Division calculated supply requirements for a century-long occupation, established supply lines across 17 star systems, and designed massive cargo vessels capable of transporting everything the invasion force might need for an extended campaign on a primitive world. We have prepared for every contingency, announced Logistics Coordinator Vrox Bingleberry during a final planning review. Our supply ships carry sufficient materials to build cities, establish communication networks, and maintain our forces for up to 200 Earth years. Nothing has been left to chance. As the training program progressed, the Empire's warriors became increasingly confident in their preparation. They had studied every aspect of human civilization, mastered every tactical scenario, and prepared for every possible defensive strategy that 1950s humans might employ against them. The final examinations were elaborate affairs that tested everything the warriors had learned. Students were required to demonstrate their ability to neutralize human police officers who appeared to be poorly armed individuals whose main tactic was saying, "You'll never take me alive," to navigate human urban environments, which looked suspiciously like New York City sound stages, and to communicate with human civilians using proper 1950s vernacular. "Attention, human," a typical graduating warrior would announce during his final examination. "We are from outer space. You will take us to your leader. Resistance is futile." The examining instructors would nod approvingly as the student demonstrated the proper techniques for dealing with human responses such as "Holy mackerel," or "Gee whiz, mister," or the more aggressive "Over my dead body, you space creep." The graduation ceremonies were spectacular events that celebrated the completion of the most thorough military training program in galactic history. Each graduating class received ceremonial weapons, commemorative medals, and thick binders containing everything they needed to know about conquering Earth. "You are now ready," Commander Vex Thula would announce to each graduating class. "You have trained for 100 years. You know every human tactic, every human weakness, every human defensive strategy. When we invade Earth, nothing will surprise you." The warriors would cheer enthusiastically, secure in the knowledge that they were the most prepared invasion force in galactic history. They had studied diagrams of human cities based on dragnet episodes, memorized the weaknesses of human vehicles based on the Andy Griffith Show, and learned to counter human military tactics based on war movies from the 1940s. The fleet itself was a marvel of military engineering. Task Force Magnificent Doom consisted of 347 ships of various sizes, from massive dreadnoughts capable of reducing continents to smoking rubble, to smaller scout vessels designed for what the manual optimistically called precision civilian intimidation. The flagship, designated Bringer of Inevitable Conquest, was the largest warship the Empire had ever constructed. It carried a crew of 12,000, enough supplies to sustain itself for 50 years, and weapons systems capable of sterilizing entire planets if diplomacy failed. "This vessel represents the pinnacle of Krillaxian engineering," announced Fleet Admiral Corks Nafat during the ship's christening ceremony. "Its quantum phase disruptors can penetrate any known defensive technology. Its gravitational manipulation fields can reshape planetary surfaces, and its universal translators are programmed with the most comprehensive database of human language ever assembled." The smaller ships were equally impressive. The destroyers carried enough firepower to level human cities. The cruisers were equipped with advanced scanning equipment capable of analyzing primitive human technology, and the scout ships were designed to infiltrate Earth's atmosphere without detection by human radar systems. The support vessels were marvels of logistical planning. Supply ships carried everything the invasion force might need, from spare parts for their weapons to entertainment systems designed to keep morale high during the expected long occupation. Medical ships were equipped with the latest healing technology and staffed with doctors trained specifically in treating wounds inflicted by primitive human weapons. "We have thought of everything," declared Chief Supply Officer Blux Wimpleworth as he conducted the final inventory checks. "Our forces will want for nothing during their stay on Earth." The cultural preparation was equally thorough. The Empire's anthropologists had spent decades analyzing human society based on the intercepted broadcasts, developing detailed studies of human customs, religious practices, and social hierarchies. "Humans appear to worship a variety of primitive deities," reported Chief Anthropologist Crex Bimbleton in her final briefing. "These include supernatural beings called Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, and the Tooth Fairy. They also venerate celebrities such as Elvis Presley and Marilyn Monroe, whose images appear frequently in their broadcasts." The psychological profiles were equally detailed. Human behavior patterns had been analyzed down to the smallest detail, including their apparent tendency to resolve conflicts through talking things out, their obsession with something called dating, and their inexplicable habit of expressing strong emotions through singing and dancing. "The typical human response to stress," explained Dr. Vrux Whifflebottom during a pre-invasion briefing, "is to gather in groups and engage in synchronized musical performances. We must be prepared for the possibility that they will attempt to defeat us through coordinated singing." The final battle plans were masterpieces of military strategy. Every possible scenario had been considered, from the expected immediate surrender of human forces to the more challenging possibility that they might attempt to hide in their primitive buildings and throw small objects at the invasion force. Phase 1. explained General Blorg-Weasel during the final strategy briefing. We establish orbital superiority and neutralize any human aircraft that attempt to interfere with our operations. Phase 2, we deploy landing forces to strategic locations and demand the immediate surrender of local human authorities. Phase 3, we establish communication with human leadership and begin negotiations for the peaceful transfer of planetary control. Phase 4, we begin the systematic colonization of Earth's most valuable real estate. The timeline was equally detailed. The planners had calculated that the entire invasion should take no more than 72 hours from initial contact to complete planetary conquest. This seemed like a generous time frame, given that they were dealing with a species whose most advanced weapons appeared to fire small metal pellets at subsonic velocities. "We have prepared for every contingency," Commander Vexathula announced during the final pre-departure ceremony. "Our warriors are trained, our ships are ready, our plans are perfect. When the people of Earth see our magnificent fleet approaching their primitive world, they will have no choice but to surrender immediately." The departure from Krilaxian space was a spectacular event. Millions of citizens gathered to watch Task Force Magnificent Doom begin its journey to Earth, their tentacles waving enthusiastically as the massive fleet engaged its hyperdrive systems and disappeared into the cosmic void. The journey itself took several weeks, during which the crew conducted final equipment checks, reviewed their battle plans one last time, and engaged in the time-honored military tradition of complaining about the food in the mess halls. "I don't understand why we can't have decent Groxnick stew," complained Private Threx Bimmelbop during a typical meal break. "This processed nutrition paste tastes like recycled machinery lubricant." "Stop complaining," replied Sergeant Clux Whippleton. "You'll be eating human food soon enough. According to our intelligence, they consume something called hamburgers and hot dogs, which sound absolutely fascinating." The crew spent their free time studying human culture through the intercepted broadcasts, practicing their English pronunciation and speculating about what life would be like on Earth after the conquest. "I've always wanted to try human baseball," mused Corporal Nerex Bugelheimer during an off-duty conversation. "According to the broadcasts, it involves hitting a small spherical object with a wooden stick. It sounds delightfully primitive." "I'm more interested in their television programming," replied Private Blocks Thimbleton. "The humans appear to spend considerable time sitting in groups and watching moving pictures. I wonder if they'll let us participate in this ritual after we conquer them." As the fleet approached the Sol system, anticipation reached fever pitch. This was the moment they had trained for, planned for, and dreamed about for 100 years. Earth was finally within reach, and soon the Krilaxian Empire would add another world to its growing collection of conquered planets. The first sign that things might not go according to plan came when the fleet dropped out of hyperspace near Luna and immediately encountered something that wasn't supposed to exist, according to their intelligence files. Orbital infrastructure. "Commander!" screamed Navigation Officer Blurkswither, whose primary responsibility was making sure they didn't accidentally fly into any celestial bodies. "We're detecting multiple artificial objects in Earth's orbital space." "Impossible," replied Vexthula, checking his instruments frantically. "Our intelligence clearly states that humans lack space travel capabilities." "Sir, I'm reading dozens of metallic objects. They appear to be satellites of some kind." This was the first crack in their perfect plan. According to everything they knew about humans, space travel was purely fictional. Yet here they were, staring at evidence that humans had not only reached orbit, but had established a significant presence there. "Perhaps they're natural phenomena," suggested Communications Officer Vrex Bimblethorpe, whose optimism often exceeded her common sense. "Metallic asteroids, very small metallic asteroids." But their problems were just beginning. As the fleet moved closer to Earth, they encountered more and more evidence that their intelligence about human capabilities might have been somewhat outdated. The small metallic objects weren't just floating randomly in space. They were clearly artificial constructs following precise orbital patterns. "Commander," announced sensor technician Mollix Grande, squinting at her displays with all 6 of her eyes. "One of those objects is moving directly toward us." The object in question was actually a routine satellite launched by SpaceX the previous Tuesday to expand Earth's communication network. It was following a perfectly normal trajectory that happened to intersect with the Krillaxian fleet's approach vector. To the aliens, however, it looked like a deliberate attack. "Evasive maneuvers!" shouted Vex Thula, his carefully rehearsed invasion speech suddenly forgotten in the face of unexpected opposition. But it was too late. The satellite, which weighed approximately 600 kilograms and was traveling at several thousand kilometers per hour, collided with their starboard sensor array in what could only be described as the most expensive traffic accident in galactic history. The explosion wasn't particularly large by military standards, but it had several unfortunate consequences. First, it knocked out their primary communication system, making coordination between ships significantly more difficult. Second, it damaged their main sensor array, reducing their ability to detect other orbital objects. And third, most devastatingly, it completely destroyed the coffee maker in the flagship's officer mess. "Damage report!" barked Fleet Admiral Korksnafat, trying to maintain his composure while privately wondering if this was some sort of cosmic joke. "Sir, we've lost primary communications. Sensor array is operating at 60% efficiency and—" The damage control officer paused, his voice breaking with emotion. "The coffee maker is completely destroyed." A moment of silence fell over the bridge as the crew absorbed this devastating news. Krillaxian military culture revolved around coffee consumption to an almost religious degree. The loss of their coffee maker was more than a mechanical failure. It was a spiritual catastrophe. "Can it be repaired?" asked Korksnafat hopefully. "I'm afraid not, sir. The entire brewing mechanism has been vaporized. We're down to emergency caffeine tablets." The morale impact was immediate and severe. Krillaxian warriors, who had been confident and eager for battle just moments before, were now faced with the prospect of conducting a planetary invasion while suffering from caffeine withdrawal. But there was no time to dwell on their losses. More satellites were appearing on their screens, and the fleet was having difficulty distinguishing between deliberately launched weapons and random space debris. "Sir," announced the sensor operator, "we're detecting multiple incoming objects. They appear to be defensive missiles." What they were actually detecting was a combination of communication satellites, weather monitoring equipment, GPS devices, and various pieces of space junk that had been accumulating in Earth's orbit for decades. To the caffeine-deprived Krillaxian crews, however, it looked like a sophisticated defensive network. "Battle stations!" ordered Korksnafat. "All ships prepare for combat." The next few hours were a masterpiece of military confusion. The Krillaxian fleet, now operating under the assumption that they were under attack by advanced human space forces, began evasive maneuvers to avoid what they believed were enemy weapons. This led to a series of increasingly unfortunate collisions with orbital debris. The destroyer, bringer of swift doom, collided with a defunct weather satellite and lost its main antenna. The cruiser, harbinger of inevitable victory, was struck by a piece of an old space station and suffered damage to its environmental systems. The scout ship, whisper of approaching terror, had a close encounter with what appeared to be a large wrench that had been orbiting Earth since 1969. "How are the humans coordinating these attacks?" demanded Vex Thula, as reports of damage poured in from across the fleet. "Their defensive network is more sophisticated than we anticipated," replied his tactical officer, trying to make sense of the chaos unfolding around them. "They're using kinetic weapons launched from multiple orbital platforms." The truth, of course, was that nobody on Earth had even noticed their arrival. The satellite collision had been automatically logged by tracking systems as routine space debris impact, and the relevant paperwork had been filed away in a computer database that wouldn't be reviewed until the following Thursday. But the Krelaxian fleet, now convinced that they were facing a coordinated defense, accelerated their invasion timeline. What had been planned as a careful 3-day approach became a desperate 6-hour rush toward the planet's surface. "All ships," broadcast Korsnefat to the fleet, "emergency landing protocol Alpha 7. We'll establish our beachhead on the surface and regroup." Emergency Landing Protocol Alpha 7 had been designed for situations where orbital superiority could not be maintained, and ground forces needed to be deployed immediately. It involved rapid atmospheric entry and immediate establishment of defensive positions on the planet's surface. The problem was that Alpha 7 had been designed for planets with properly organized military infrastructure. The protocol assumed that enemy forces would be concentrated around obvious strategic targets, like military bases, government buildings, and communication centers. Earth, unfortunately, had no idea it was being invaded, and therefore had not bothered to organize its defenses according to Krelaxian military doctrine. There were no convenient military target signs, no organized resistance waiting at predetermined coordinates, and certainly nobody who had cleared the landing zones of obstacles. The fleet's descent through Earth's atmosphere was a study in cascading disasters. Ships that had been designed for elegant orbital insertion found themselves plummeting through clouds while trying to avoid commercial aircraft, weather balloons, and the occasional migrating bird. "Commander!" screamed the pilot of the flagship as they dropped through the cloud layer. "We're detecting multiple fast-moving objects in the atmosphere." "Human fighter aircraft," replied Vex Thula grimly. "Prepare for air-to-air combat." What they had actually detected were 3 commercial airliners, a cargo plane, a weather research aircraft, and a flock of Canadian geese. But without their primary sensor array and operating on outdated intelligence about human aviation capabilities, the Krelaxian crews had no way of knowing this. The result was a series of near misses that would have been comedy gold if anyone had been filming. The flagship, bringer of inevitable conquest, executed a barrel roll to avoid what its pilot thought was an incoming missile, but was actually Delta Flight 447 from Phoenix to Denver. The cruiser Herald of Ultimate Doom performed an emergency dive to evade what appeared to be a formation of enemy fighters, but turned out to be a V-shaped formation of migrating waterfowl. "The humans are more agile than we expected," reported Squadron Leader Threx Bimblehort as he watched a commercial jet disappear into a cloud bank. "Their aircraft are fast and maneuverable." By the time the first wave of landing craft reached the surface, the invasion force had already suffered more casualties than in any previous Krelaxian military operation, and they hadn't even encountered any actual human resistance yet. The landing site selection was handled by the fleet's tactical computers, which had been programmed to identify optimal strategic locations based on their understanding of human civilization. The computers analyzed the terrain below, looking for sites that matched their criteria for military importance. Large, flat areas near population centers with good visibility and defensible positions. What the computers found was Millfield Municipal Golf Course, just outside Tucson, Arizona. By Krelaxian standards, it was perfect. A large, open area with maintained vegetation close to human settlements, with clear sightlines in all directions, and what appeared to be defensive water features strategically positioned throughout the facility. The computers had no way of knowing that what they were looking at was a recreational facility where humans came to hit small balls with sticks for entertainment. To the artificial intelligence systems, the golf course looked like a military installation designed for training purposes. "Strategic location, Gamma Prime identified," announced the tactical computer in its perfectly calm artificial voice. Large flat area with maintained perimeter, multiple water obstacles for defensive purposes, adjacent to human population center, probability of military significance 87%. And so it was that 50,000 of the galaxy's most thoroughly trained warriors, supported by the most advanced invasion fleet in known space, prepared to establish their beachhead on the 14th hole of a municipal golf course in Arizona. The first landing craft touched down at exactly 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. The sun was shining, the temperature was a pleasant 74 degrees Fahrenheit, and groundskeeper Harold Wixworth was having what he thought was going to be a perfectly ordinary day right up until several hundred tons of alien spacecraft crashed into his freshly maintained putting green. Harold had been working at Millfield Municipal Golf Course for 37 years. He had started as a teenager looking for summer work and had gradually worked his way up to head groundskeeper, a position he took very seriously. In his decades of service, he had dealt with every kind of challenge a golf course could present: drought, floods, insects, diseases, vandalism, and the occasional drunk golfer who thought it would be funny to drive a cart into a water hazard. But in all his years of experience, Harold had never had to deal with an alien invasion. This was, technically speaking, outside his job description. Harold was trimming grass around the fourth hole when the first ship came down. He heard the roar of atmospheric entry engines, looked up, and watched as a metallic craft, roughly the size of a city bus, descended from the sky, trailing smoke and making sounds that no properly functioning aircraft should ever make. "Oh, for crying out loud!" he shouted as the spacecraft plowed into his perfectly maintained putting green, creating a crater roughly 20 feet across and destroying 6 months of careful lawn care work. "That's the third time this month someone's messed up my greens." This was, technically speaking, an exaggeration. The previous incidents had involved a runaway food truck that had taken a wrong turn and ended up on the 7th fairway, and a flock of particularly destructive Canada geese that had decided the water hazards would make excellent nesting sites. But Harold was upset, and when Harold was upset, precision took a back seat to righteous indignation. More ships were coming down now, landing in various locations around the golf course with varying degrees of success. The second wave managed to avoid the greens, but took out most of the sand traps on the back 9. The third wave landed in the parking lot and demolished a significant portion of the clubhouse's outdoor patio furniture. Harold watched this destruction with the sort of calm resignation that comes from spending 4 decades in groundskeeping. Every golf course maintenance professional develops a philosophical acceptance of the fact that golfers, weather, and wildlife will constantly try to undo their work. Adding aliens to that list was just another challenge to overcome. The landing craft that had destroyed his putting green was now sitting silent and smoking in the crater it had created. As Harold watched, a door opened in the side of the spacecraft with what the designers had intended to be an intimidating pneumatic hiss. Unfortunately, damage sustained during landing had reduced the effect to something that sounded more like a deflating balloon at a children's birthday party. Commander Vexthula Grimjaw emerged from the spacecraft in full ceremonial battle armor. His forearms moved with practiced military precision as he surveyed the landing site. His plasma rifle was charged and ready for combat. His universal translator was programmed with extensive databases of human language and culture. He was, by every measure that mattered to the Krelaxian military, prepared for anything Earth could throw at him. What he wasn't prepared for was Harold Wixworth standing 3 feet away, wearing grass-stained overalls and holding a pair of hedge clippers, looking at him with the expression of a man who had just discovered that someone had parked their car in his flower bed. For a moment, neither of them moved. Vexthula was experiencing something that military psychologists would later classify as acute cognitive dissonance with paranoid overtones. According to everything he had learned about humans, they should have been terrified by his appearance. They should have been running away screaming, or falling to their knees in awe, or at the very least looking impressed by his advanced technology. Instead, this human was looking at him like he was a particularly annoying problem that needed to be solved before lunch. Harold, for his part, was taking in the alien's appearance with the calm, analytical mind of someone who had spent decades solving practical problems. 4 arms, unusual, but probably useful for carrying things. Tentacles, weird, but no weirder than some of the golfers he'd encountered over the years. Advanced armor and weapons, clearly compensation for something. "Surrender, primitive life form," Vex'Thula finally declared, in what he believed to be perfect English, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had practiced this speech in front of a mirror for the better part of a century. "I am Commander Vex'Thula, Grimjaw of the Krelaxian Empire, and this world is now under our dominion." Harold squinted at the alien for a moment, processing this information with the same methodical approach he used when deciding which fertilizer to use on the rough. He took in the dramatic pose, the glowing weapons, and the general air of menace that Vex'Thula was projecting. "Oh, hell no," Harold replied with considerable feeling, his voice carrying 37 years of dealing with people who didn't respect his golf course. "I don't care if you're the Emperor of Mars, the King of Jupiter, or the Tooth Fairy's cousin, you just destroyed my putting green. Do you have any idea how long it takes to grow grass in this desert?" Vex'Thula's universal translator, which had been programmed with extensive databases of 1950s American English, was having some difficulty parsing Harold's response. The computer helpfully suggested that "hell no" was some sort of primitive war cry. Emperor of Mars was clearly a reference to advanced human space travel capabilities that their intelligence had somehow missed. And Tooth Fairy's cousin was obviously the designation for a high-ranking military officer in the human command structure. I do not understand your aggressive stance, human warrior," Vex'Thula stammered, suddenly realizing that his carefully rehearsed invasion speech wasn't having the desired effect. "You should be cowering in fear at our technological superiority." Harold looked at the smoking spacecraft, which was now making ominous grinding noises and leaking something that looked suspiciously like alien motor oil onto his immaculate fairway. He had seen more impressive technology in the clubhouse bathroom. "Technological superiority?" Harold laughed, a sound that contained 37 years of dealing with broken sprinkler systems, temperamental golf carts, and members who thought they knew better than the maintenance staff. "Buddy, I've seen more impressive technology in a kid's toy store. Your fancy spaceship looks like it was put together with duct tape, wishful thinking, and a prayer to whatever gods handle warranty claims." This response caused something fundamental to break inside Vex'Thula's worldview. According to everything he knew about humans, they should have been terrified, awestruck, or at the very least impressed by his arrival. Instead, this apparent human warrior was critiquing his spacecraft's engineering with the casual authority of someone who knew what they were talking about. But we are the Krelaxian Empire," Vex'Thula protested weakly, his voice rising to a pitch that would have been embarrassing if anyone from his home planet had been listening. "We have conquered 17 star systems. Our military might is legendary across the galaxy." Harold adjusted his work gloves and gave the alien the same look he reserved for golf carts that wouldn't start on busy Saturday mornings. 17 star systems? Harold repeated, his tone suggesting that he was not particularly impressed. "That's nice, honey. I've been maintaining 18 holes for 37 years, and I've never had one of them crash land in my parking lot. Maybe you should work on your landing technique before you go around conquering things." It was at this precise moment that Vex'Thula began to suspect that their century of intelligence gathering might have been somewhat incomplete. The situation was deteriorating rapidly across the entire golf course. More landing craft were touching down every few minutes, disgorging confused Krelaxian warriors who had trained extensively to fight 1950s humans, but were now faced with the reality of 21st century recreational facility management. Squad leader Nox Thyril had established what he thought was a defensive perimeter around the water hazard on the seventh hole, but his carefully planned military position was being systematically disrupted by the arrival of maintenance worker Betty Lou Perkins, who was driving her beverage cart directly toward his position with the unstoppable determination of someone who had 23 years of customer service experience. "Excuse me, sweeties," Betty Lou called out cheerfully as she parked her cart next to a group of heavily armed alien warriors. "You boys need to move along. We've got a senior citizens tournament starting in 20 minutes, and these folks don't like to be kept waiting." Nox Thyril stared at the small pink vehicle that had just appeared in his defensive zone. According to his training, this was clearly some sort of armored personnel carrier designed to blend in with civilian infrastructure. The fact that it was bright pink with decorative flowers painted on the sides only confirmed his suspicions about human military deception tactics. "Hostile vehicle has penetrated our perimeter," he screamed into his communicator, his voice cracking with panic. "Requesting immediate backup. The humans are more cunning than we anticipated." Betty Lou, completely oblivious to the fact that she was being classified as a military threat, began unloading coolers of sports drinks and prepackaged sandwiches from her cart. She'd been working the beverage cart at Millfield Municipal for 15 years, and in that time she had developed the kind of customer service skills that made her completely immune to surprise, confusion, or alien invasion. "Now what can I get you folks?" she asked in the tone of someone who had dealt with every possible type of difficult customer and was therefore prepared for anything. "We've got cold drinks, hot coffee, and I just made a fresh batch of egg salad sandwiches this morning." Nox Thyril looked at the human female who was apparently offering him sustenance instead of fleeing in terror. This was completely outside his training parameters. According to everything he had learned about human behavior, civilians were supposed to run away screaming when confronted with superior alien technology. What is an egg salad?" he asked weakly, his plasma rifle hanging forgotten at his side. "Oh, honey, you've never had egg salad?" Betty Lou's maternal instincts kicked in immediately. She had raised 3 children and 6 grandchildren, and she recognized the look of someone who needed feeding when she saw it. "Well, aren't you just the sweetest thing? Here, try one of these." She handed him a sandwich wrapped in plastic, which Nox Thyril accepted reflexively. The moment he took a bite, 2 things happened simultaneously. His taste buds experienced something that could only be described as transcendent culinary revelation, and his entire understanding of human technological capabilities underwent a complete and total collapse. The sandwich was, without any exaggeration whatsoever, the most delicious thing he had ever tasted in his 7 decades of existence. The perfect balance of flavors, the ideal texture, the way the mayonnaise complemented the eggs while the seasoning added just the right amount of complexity. It was a masterpiece of food science that put Krelaxian military rations to shame. "Sweet tentacles of the cosmic void," he exclaimed after swallowing his first bite. "What sorcery is this?" "It's just eggs, Mayo, and a little bit of mustard, sweetie," Betty Lou replied modestly. "The secret is to use fresh herbs from my garden. Would you like another one?" Nox Thyril stared at her in growing horror. If humans could create something this magnificent from simple ingredients, what other technological marvels were they hiding? What devastating weapons could a species capable of such culinary perfection develop if they put their minds to it? "Command!" he shouted into his communicator, his voice breaking with emotion and existential dread. "The humans have developed some sort of incredible food technology. I think we may have seriously underestimated their capabilities." Similar scenes were playing out across the golf course as more Krelaxian warriors encountered the reality of human hospitality. Squad 3 had been completely neutralized by the appearance of a group of senior citizens who had arrived early for their tournament and were now offering the confused aliens coffee and donuts, while asking detailed questions about their home planet's climate and social customs. "So you're from outer space?" asked Mrs. Henderson, a 78-year-old retired teacher who had never met a stranger she couldn't turn into a friend given enough time and baked goods. "How exciting! I've always wondered what other planets were like. Is it true that you don't have seasons?" Squad leader Grixmalot, a decorated veteran of 3 interplanetary campaigns, found himself sitting on a park bench explaining Krylaxian atmospheric conditions while eating what Mrs. Henderson called "my famous snickerdoodles." He had trained for decades to resist human torture techniques, but he was completely unprepared for an elderly grandmother asking about his family while feeding him homemade cookies. "Well, you see," he found himself saying, his military bearing completely forgotten, "Krylax Prime has a binary star system, so we have very complex seasonal patterns." "How fascinating," Mrs. Henderson replied, refilling his coffee cup. "And do you have children? You look like you'd be wonderful with children." Within minutes, Grixmalot was showing her pictures on his communicator and explaining that yes, Krylaxian children did lose their tentacles when they got older, and no, it didn't hurt. It was perfectly natural, just like human children losing their baby teeth. Back at the command ship, which was now listing at a 30-degree angle in what used to be the water hazard on the 12th hole, Fleet Admiral Korksnafat was receiving increasingly frantic and confusing reports from his ground forces. "Sir, Squad 7 reports that the humans have deployed some sort of psychological warfare device. They're calling it hospitality. Squad 12 has encountered human defensive fortifications. They appear to be called golf carts, and they're everywhere. Commander, Squad 3 has been completely neutralized by human chemical warfare agents. The weapons appear to be dispensed from mobile platforms and come in flavors including cherry, blue raspberry, and something called Diet Cola." Korksnafat felt a growing sense of dread as he studied the tactical displays. Their intelligence had clearly been catastrophically wrong about human capabilities. Not only did they possess advanced orbital defense systems that had decimated their fleet during approach, but their ground forces were employing sophisticated psychological warfare techniques that their own warriors seemed powerless against. "Get me a direct line to Commander Vex Thula," he ordered, his voice carrying the strain of someone whose perfect century-long plan was falling apart in real time. But Vex Thula was currently experiencing his own crisis of command authority. Harold had spent the last 15 minutes explaining the basics of golf course maintenance, and the alien commander was beginning to understand that he had landed his invasion force in the middle of what humans called a recreational facility, not a military installation, not a strategic government complex, not even a training ground for human warriors. A place where people came to hit small balls with sticks for entertainment. "You mean to tell me," Vexthular said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of dawning comprehension, "that this entire complex exists solely for entertainment purposes?" "Well, duh," Harold replied, with the patience of someone explaining something obvious to someone who should have known better. "What did you think it was? A military base? A government facility? It's a golf course, for crying out loud. People pay money to come here and hit little white balls around." The silence that followed was the sound of a century of military planning collapsing under the weight of its own absurdity. But our intelligence indicated that humans were primitive, limited technology, simple social structures. Vexthula's voice was becoming increasingly high-pitched as the reality of the situation began to sink in. "You're supposed to be cowering in fear of our superior weapons." Harold looked around at the chaos unfolding across his golf course, where Krylaxian warriors were being systematically defeated by senior citizens offering them lemonade, maintenance workers providing technical advice about their broken spacecraft, and Betty Lou's devastating deployment of sandwich-based psychological warfare. "Primitive," Harold laughed, a sound that contained 37 years of dealing with people who underestimated the complexity of modern life. Buddy, we put 12 men on the moon, built a space station that's been continuously occupied for over 2 decades, and invented a global communication network that lets my grandson show me videos of cats playing piano that 3 million people have watched. Last week I ordered lunch from my phone and had it delivered by a robot. What have you accomplished lately besides crashing into my putting green? And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the moment when the Kralaxian invasion officially ended. It wasn't a military defeat in any traditional sense. There were no heroic last stands, no desperate battles against overwhelming odds, no dramatic sacrifices for the good of humanity. Instead, it was the slow, creeping, absolutely devastating realization that they had spent 100 years preparing to fight an enemy that existed only in their outdated intelligence files. The real humans, as it turned out, were something far more terrifying than any warrior race the Kralaxians had ever encountered. They were a species that had somehow managed to combine advanced technology with casual friendliness, devastating military capability with an inexplicable desire to feed strangers, and the ability to casually mention putting people on the moon while complaining about damaged lawn care. Major Claxumberland, a veteran of 17 planetary invasions who had earned commendations for bravery under fire, discovered that his plasma rifle was completely useless against what the humans called the beverage cart of doom. The small pink vehicle had somehow surrounded his entire squad and was dispensing cold drinks faster than his warriors could refuse them. "Would you prefer Diet Cola or regular?" asked the cart's operator, a cheerful human female who seemed completely unaware that she was addressing heavily armed alien invaders. Claxumberland tried to maintain military discipline, but when faced with a direct question about beverage preferences, something fundamental broke inside his combat conditioning. He had been trained to resist interrogation, to withstand torture, to maintain operational security under the most extreme circumstances. But nobody had prepared him for customer service. I'm not sure," he admitted weakly. "What's the difference?" "Well, Diet Cola has fewer calories, but some people say it doesn't taste as good," the human explained patiently. "Regular has more sugar, but it's the classic flavor. First time trying Earth beverages?" And just like that, Major Claxumberland found himself engaged in a detailed discussion about human beverage technology, while his squad stood around drinking soda and eating snacks. Within 20 minutes, they had learned more about Earth culture than their intelligence division had discovered in a century of monitoring. The psychological impact was devastating. These weren't the primitive creatures they had trained to fight. These were members of a species that had casually achieved interplanetary travel, developed global communication networks, and created beverages with multiple flavor options as a matter of routine convenience. Commander Vexathula found himself sitting on a bench next to Harold, sharing what the human called a cold beer and listening to stories about the challenges of desert landscaping. The beer, he had to admit, was significantly better than standard Kralaxian military rations, and the conversation was more interesting than most strategic planning meetings. "So, Harold," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of someone whose entire worldview had been fundamentally altered. "Hypothetically speaking, if an alien invasion force were to land on your planet, what do you think would happen?" Harold took a long sip of his beer and considered the question with the same methodical approach he used when planning seasonal lawn care schedules. "Well," he said thoughtfully, "I suppose we'd probably invite them to dinner and ask a lot of questions. Humans are pretty curious about stuff like that. Plus, my wife makes a hell of a casserole, and she's always looking for excuses to cook for more people." Vexthula nodded slowly, processing this information. "And if these hypothetical aliens had, say, accidentally damaged some property during their arrival?" "Oh, we'd probably make them help fix it," Harold replied with a grin that contained decades of practical wisdom. "Nothing builds character like a little manual labor." Plus, I could use the help getting these greens back in shape. You guys made quite a mess. The final nail in the coffin of the Krylaxian invasion came when Fleet Admiral Corks Nefat received a communication from Earth's government. Not a military response demanding surrender, not a declaration of war, not even a strongly worded diplomatic protest. Instead, it was a politely worded message from something called the Department of Agriculture, asking if they needed assistance with landing permits and whether any of their species had dietary restrictions they should be aware of for catering purposes. The message, which had been composed by a junior staffer named Janet, who had seen the news reports about unusual aircraft incidents at the golf course, concluded with an invitation to a welcome reception at the local community center, complete with a potluck dinner and live music by the Tucson Senior Citizens Swing Band. "Dear visitors," the message read, "welcome to Earth. We understand you may have experienced some technical difficulties during your arrival. The Tucson Department of Emergency Management is standing by to provide assistance with any medical needs, transportation issues, or accommodation requirements. We've also arranged for a cultural exchange dinner this Friday at 7 p.m. at the Millfield Community Center. Please let us know about any dietary restrictions. Looking forward to meeting you. Janet Morrison, Deputy Assistant Coordinator for Unusual Events." Corks Nefat stared at the message for several minutes, reading it over and over again, as if repetition might somehow make it make sense. Then he walked over to the nearest airlock and screamed into the void of space for approximately 47 seconds, which was the maximum amount of time he could hold his breath in the vacuum. When he was finished, he opened a communication channel to all ships in the fleet. "All units," he announced, with the weary resignation of someone whose entire career had just become a cautionary tale that would be studied in military academies for generations. "Prepare for immediate withdrawal. Operation Terrestrial Cleansing is postponed indefinitely." The retreat, if it could be dignified with such a military term, was even more chaotic than the invasion. After the landing craft wouldn't start due to sand in their engines, courtesy of Harold's overly enthusiastic sprinkler system, 3 ships had to be towed out of water hazards by human tow trucks whose operators refused payment but did ask for autographs and selfies with the alien crews. "This is so cool," exclaimed Jake Morrison, a local mechanic who had been called in to help with the unusual vehicle recovery situation. "Can I get a picture with you for my Instagram? My followers are never going to believe this." Squad leader Blix North found his transport completely disabled when Mrs. Henderson's grandson, a well-meaning automotive technician, helpfully tried to fix their hyperdrive with a set of jumper cables and succeeded in overloading their entire electrical system. "I've never seen an engine like this before," Bobby Henderson announced cheerfully as sparks flew from the alien spacecraft's propulsion system. "But don't worry, I've got this. My uncle taught me everything there is to know about fixing cars." The repair took 4 hours, during which the squad was fed a steady stream of sandwiches and lemonade, while Mrs. Henderson interrogated them about Krylaxian family structures, social customs, and whether they had anything like Medicare on their home planet. "So you don't have universal health care?" she asked, genuinely concerned. "Well, that's just terrible. How do you take care of your elderly?" By sunset, the last of the Krylaxian ships was limping away from Earth's atmosphere, their holds full of goodbye gifts from the people of Tucson. These included 17 casserole dishes, 43 jars of homemade preserves, a cooler full of Betty Lou's famous egg salad sandwiches, and one very confused golf cart that she had insisted they take for the road. "You boys take care of yourselves," Betty Lou called out as the last transport lifted off from the parking lot. "And don't be strangers. You're welcome back any time." The official Krylaxian after-action report, which was immediately classified at the highest levels and buried in filing systems so deep that archaeological expeditions would have trouble finding them, contained the following summary. Earth invasion attempt resulted in total mission failure. due to catastrophic intelligence errors spanning approximately 70 years. Human species demonstrates advanced technological capabilities far exceeding initial assessments, combined with inexplicable behavioral patterns that render traditional military doctrine completely ineffective. Recommendation: add Earth to the galactic Do Not Disturb list immediately and institute mandatory memory modification for all personnel involved to prevent psychological trauma. Also recommend immediate study of human egg salad technology by our best scientists. The report also noted in a small footnote that would become the stuff of legend among military historians throughout the galaxy that human hospitality appeared to be a form of weaponized kindness so devastating that it could neutralize trained warriors without causing any physical harm whatsoever. Commander Vex Thula was quietly transferred to a desk job in the Outer Rim territories, where he spent his remaining years developing new first contact protocols based on his Earth experience. His manual, Invasion Planning in the Age of Unexpected Hospitality, became required reading at military academies throughout the galaxy and spawned an entire new field of military science called Defensive Niceness Studies. Fleet Admiral Corks Nuffat retired early and opened a small restaurant specializing in Earth-style sandwiches, which became surprisingly popular among the diplomatic corps. He never spoke publicly about the invasion, but rumor had it that he kept a picture of Betty Lou's beverage cart on his office wall as a reminder that the universe was full of surprises. Harold Wixworth received a commendation from the mayor of Tucson for outstanding service in the face of extraterrestrial landscaping challenges and used the insurance money from the spacecraft damage to install a new irrigation system. He never spoke publicly about the invasion, partly because nobody would have believed him, but mostly because he had made the aliens promise to call ahead next time they wanted to visit. Common courtesy, he had explained to Vex Thula during their final conversation. That's all I'm asking for. A phone call, maybe an email. Hey, Harold, we're planning to invade on Tuesday. Is that okay? I'm a reasonable man. We could have worked something out. The golf course reopened 2 weeks later with a new water feature on the 14th hole. A small crater that Harold had converted into a decorative pond, complete with a bronze plaque reading, "Alien Landing Site. Please replace divots." The feature became quite popular with golfers, who enjoyed the novelty of putting around what they believed was an artistic interpretation of a meteor impact. Earth, meanwhile, continued its orbit around the Sun, blissfully unaware that it had just become the most feared planet in 3 star systems. The news reports described the incident as a minor aviation mishap involving experimental aircraft, and most people forgot about it entirely within a week. The few who remembered it assumed it was some sort of publicity stunt or viral marketing campaign. But in command centers across the galaxy, military planners were hastily revising their threat assessments of the small blue-green world in the Sol system. The planet that had destroyed a century-trained invasion force in 12 minutes without firing a shot had earned a reputation that would make even the most aggressive species think twice before paying them a visit. The Krillaxian Empire quietly removed Earth from their expansion charts and established a 5-light-year exclusion zone around the entire solar system. The official reason, according to their diplomatic corps, was ongoing geological surveys of unusual mineral deposits. The real reason was that nobody wanted to explain to their superiors how they had lost an entire invasion fleet to a species that defeated them with snack foods, small talk, and aggressive hospitality. The Thulorian hegemony, upon hearing about the Krillaxian debacle through the Galactic Intelligence Network, immediately cancelled their own planned invasion of Earth and redirected their forces toward a nice, safe, uninhabited star system where the worst thing they might encounter would be asteroid mining equipment. The Vorten Collective went so far as to issue a formal declaration that Earth was a protected cultural heritage site and should be preserved for future study by xenoanthropologists, preferably from a distance of several light years. And Harold Wixworth, groundskeeper extraordinaire, went back to maintaining his golf course, secure in the knowledge that he had the greenest, most well-defended putting surfaces in the known universe, protected by humanity's most devastating weapon, the unshakable conviction that problems could be solved with hard work, common sense, and a really good sandwich.